right.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our panel. My name is Michael French. This is Melinda Mock. We are RetroBlasting. We are a web channel on YouTube or a blog. We've been around since May of 2012. And I have to be confident in saying this is the best audience because you guys obviously love Temple of Doom, and so do we. So we're really excited to have you here today. This is going to be fun. Just a little bit about who we are before we get started. We are obviously, I'll put it to you this way. Melinda has real archaeology experience, as you can see, and I, on the other hand, still live in a fantasy world where you get to shoot Nazis while you look for ancient artifacts.
So between the two of us, we totally got it covered.
We both love Indiana Jones. We both love this genre. We love Alan Quatermain, Lara Croft, all of these characters. And then just a little bit about my background. I used to be a staff writer for the Raider.net, which is one of the larger Indiana Jones fan sites on the net. I was also a staff member of IndieGear.com, which is the place where guys want to go to get all the Indiana Jones clothing. So they have arguments about what shade of brown his jacket was. I'm not lying.
So if you're excited by that, go check it out.
Yeah, it is a fun website for people who really are sticklers for details. Temple of Doom. It's been 30 years, not to age everybody in the room and make us all feel like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. This was 1984. This was the year of Beverly Hills Cop, the year of Ghostbusters, the year of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. And Temple of Doom was the third highest grossing film that year, if I recall. But funnily enough, for a long time, people have said by default, well, I like Indiana Jones a lot. Temple of Doom is my least favorite. And I think it's time to look back on it 30 years later and see how it's aged versus everything else. I think it's worth revisiting.
And in particular, since other movies have come out since that time, like this movie.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. Kind of just went over this, but it was 1984. George Lucas was going through a divorce. He admits he wasn't very happy in his life at this point. Steven Spielberg was under a contractual obligation to do 3 Indiana Jones films, and they were looking to do something fresh and different. They wanted to make something darker. They wanted to make something edgier. They wanted to make something that wasn't Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so they set about doing that, for better or worse, depending on what critics you read. Just to recap the story for those of you who might not have seen the film, it's a story about Indiana Jones trying to save enslaved children and recapture ancient magical stones from an evil cult in India. That presented some problems in the aftermath and even during production. India didn't want them filming in their country because they found the script to be offensive to their culture. And then in the backlash, the critics said that there were certain elements of the film that were stereotypical. Some of them they felt were racist. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. But I wanted to talk about the Temple of Doom on an angle first for those of you who might not be aware. Temple of Doom I have always found to be secretly brilliant, deceptively brilliant, because Temple of Doom, while set in 1935, which is 1 year before Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is set in 1936, it is not actually a follow-up or prequel to Raiders of the Lost Ark so much as it is a direct sequel to the 1939 adventure film Gunga Din with Cary Grant. And I'm going to tell you what I mean by this. We're going to go through this real quick. And that's why I find this movie so cool, because it has this hidden legacy inside the film that if you watch it and you know your film history, you're actually watching something that's connected to our collective film experience. So both films start with a gong. Then there is a bar fight. In the case of the Cary Grant movie, he's looking for a map to an ancient buried treasure, and he's a British soldier in India. And then, of course, in Temple of Doom, he's trying to get the diamond from Lao Che. They find a deserted village in the middle of the Indian countryside where all the people have either disappeared or there's sort of a malaise going on. They have to figure out what's happened. Then there's a journey on elephants. Then they find a palace, a legendary palace. And in the case of the Gunga Din movie, it's a temple of gold. And then in Indiana Jones, of course, it's
a matte painting.
Yes, a matte painting. They witness an ancient ceremony after they sneak into the temple. There is a cult with, they're called THUGGEEs in both films. They see the idol of Kali. There is an evil guru who they film the exact same way in both films. Then the hero is tortured. Then there's a rope bridge where they try and escape. Then the Thuggee show up to try and stop them. And then the British Army shows up to save them. Now the interesting thing about this is that it's not just them remaking Gunga Din. It might look that way, but they acknowledge what they're trying to do in Temple of Doom. So to its credit, the famous scene where they eat monkey brains and eyeball soup and all that stuff, there's a line from the British general at the table. And he says, the Thuggee were an obscenity that worship Kali with human sacrifice. The British Army nicely did away with them. That's referencing the events of Gunga Din, which happened about, I think, 60 or 80 years before Temple of Doom is set. So I think that's really awesome that we're actually watching sort of a heartfelt sequel to a movie that never got a sequel. It's kind of neat. It's like the hidden follow-up to Cary Grant's action film.
And we already know that George Lucas and Steven Spielberg both really love older movies, film history, and a lot of this film, as we'll talk about, is sort of an homage to those serials that were back in the theaters in like the 40s and stuff like that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade just for a moment, because it was the follow-up 5 years later to Temple of Doom. There was a critical backlash on Temple of Doom. Parents didn't like the intense violence. They didn't like the gore. They didn't like the child enslavement that was going on in the movie. And so Spielberg and Lucas really started to backpedal off of their position creatively on Temple of Doom. And as a creative apology almost, I believe it was actually said in an interview before, at the time in '89, they created Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now, I love Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I saw it in the theater twice as a kid. But how has it aged 20 years later, 25 years later? In some ways, if you take away Sean Connery's brilliant performance, it's kind of this doofy, sort of bumbling movie about a goofy archaeologist. It doesn't really feel like Raiders of the Lost Ark as much as we think it does, because Sean Connery is genius in the film, and everybody else is just kind of recharacterized around him. It has the same formula as Raiders of the Lost Ark, so it's almost a carbon copy, but not with the same edge and the same grit. I would prefer to call it Diet Raiders. It really doesn't get out there and try and do things that are wildly different from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and in doing so, it just kind of becomes, in my opinion, a pale imitation. I still love the film. I think it's highly watchable. I proudly have it on my Blu-ray shelf, but I really feel like Temple of Doom, and I say this with more than one meaning, Temple of Doom has the edge on Last Crusade. And we can't really talk about this, though, without talking about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, because when that came out, even down to the shape of Indiana Jones's hat, they wanted it related to Last Crusade. They said, I know the hatter of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. He was making indie hats long before Crystal Skull was ever made. And he said that when he was asked to make a hat for Crystal Skull, he made the hat look exactly like it does in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he sent it to Steven Spielberg, and Steven Spielberg said, I'd really like it to look like it did kind of in Last Crusade. Now, I know I'm bringing out my indiegear.com thing here, but this is an example of a larger idea. They really wanted this film to roll off of Last Crusade tonally. They wanted it to roll off of Last Crusade as far as the style and structure. They even go so far in the film, if you recall, if you were pained enough to remember it, as to have this long zoom-in shot of Sean Connery's portrait on Harrison Ford's desk in the movie. It's like, remember when we made this funny movie that was really good? Please remember this movie.
You're going to need it.
Yeah, and so looking at Temple of Doom through this lens, I really feel like Temple of Doom is going to earn back some credit, I hope, with all of you. Maybe, I'm sure some of you really love it, I really love it, but let's all work together to redeem Temple of Doom.
Yeah, because there's not much to redeem this one.
Yeah. I don't know anyone who got that pre-order. I didn't.
Oddly, though, they're sold out, and you can't find them anywhere online right now that I could find.
There are
because I kind of think it's funny, and I kind of want one.
Well, when they took all the E.T. games out of Alamogordo, something back in.
We found a use for it. That's great. That's awesome.
You had to fill that hole with something. Good point. At the time, the critics were pretty negative on Temple of Doom, but I wanted to highlight two that weren't. Of course, Roger Ebert was not critical of the film. He really loved the film at the time, which is, it's understandable because Roger Ebert tends to have a wider latitude of acceptance for films within the pop culture genre than most critics. I mean, there are some films he's loved that I've hated, and there's some films he's hated that I've loved, but in the case of Temple of Doom, he really liked it. And then the surprising one is Pauline Kael. Pauline Kael hated Raiders of the Lost Ark. She hated Empire Strikes Back. This was a hardcore journalistic critic who didn't pull any punches. And she walked into Temple of Doom, and when she walked out, she said, quote, "The subject of a movie can be momentum. It has often been the true, even if not fully acknowledged, subject of movies. In Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, it's not merely acknowledged, it's glorified in. The picture has an exuberant, hurtling along spirit. The stunts are brought off with incredible precision." She found this film so entertaining. She thought it was one of the best films of the year. Pauline Kael. She hated Empire Strikes Back, and she loved this movie. So I just find that stunning. And from the get-go, Temple of Doom made no bones about trying to be different from Raiders of the Lost Ark, all the way down to the casting. Aside from Indiana Jones himself, whose attitude is a little different in Temple of Doom compared to Raiders of the Lost Ark in subtle ways, that's the only difference for him. The heroine wanted to be different. Spielberg wanted to bring Karen Allen back as Marion. George Lucas said, "I really want somebody different in each film. I want her to be blonde. I want her to be not the hard-nosed, hard-drinking, smoking chick that Marion was. I want her to be the one that's sort of like Fay Wray in King Kong. I want her to scream at everything and really reflect the movie serials of the 30s and 40s. And for better or worse, that's what we got.
Yeah, but she's pretty well hated. If you...
Yeah, this quote, "They've also come up with a heroine who's such a charmless bimbo that you have mixed feelings every time she's in jeopardy." Which... Honestly,
when I hadn't seen this movie since I was a kid when it came out, and when we met and we sat down and watched it together again, I really only remembered her screaming. That's all I remember from the whole movie, that and the monkey brains thing. Like, if you haven't seen it in a long time, I'd be curious to know if you all have the same feeling. Like, it was so grating and so annoying. And now that I'm an adult and I understand what they were trying to do in terms of really showcasing, things like I said, the serials from like the 30s and 40s when women were much more like women and they would scream, and I mean, who wouldn't scream if they were covered in bugs? I mean, seriously. But I mean, it's a little excessive in the film, and we were kind of wondering in general, how many times does she scream in the movie? So we actually looked into this, and we're gonna count how many times she screams. Amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty insane.
It's kind of funny to note that the actress really couldn't scream like that, and so every one of those is dubbed. So that's kind of impressive too.
Yeah. That is the one criticism of Temple of Doom that nobody can really get around. It's sort of the Jar Jar factor of this movie. It's like, you know what, you can make arguments for the cool lightsaber fights all day, but no one's getting around the fact that Jar Jar Binks sucks. sucks. So, in the case of Temple of Doom, it's really a shame because there are some moments where Willie's screaming, I think if it had just punctuated like key moments in the movie, it would have had impact. But because she's screaming through the whole film, it's lost on you. It's kind of like an action scene with explosions from a Michael Bay movie that drags on for an hour to the point where it just becomes white noise after a while, and you're just like, I don't care anymore. Temple of Doom is really that way. Like I think about the moment on the rope bridge where Indy says in Mandarin to Short Round that he's going to cut the bridge, and he says, hold on, we're going for a ride, to Willie, and she says, oh my God, and like when she screams at that moment, that would have been a great moment for her to scream if all the other screaming hadn't been happening throughout the whole movie. So it's a matter of balance, and unfortunately they didn't find it with this film. And sadly, Kate Capshaw, who played Willie Scott, didn't read the script before she took the part. So when she she says this on camera, I'm not making this up, when she got to the sets in Sri Lanka, she was like, I didn't realize I would be screaming this much. And then they said, oh, by the way, we're going to do the scene with the bugs tomorrow. And she's like, what bugs?
Oh, and what snake?
Oh yeah, they cut out a whole scene with a snake. There was gonna be a snake in sort of a pool of water in the jungle with her, and she freaked out about that, and they cut that out.
There's some great footage actually of her begging them to not do the bug scene because she was so completely freaked out. And honestly, after seeing the behind the scenes and you watch the scene after that, it's like she was not acting at all. She was completely freaked out, which who could blame her, honestly?
Yeah, they were taking sand buckets full of huge tropical roaches and just dropping them half a story onto her head, over and over again on the set.
All day.
I was like, you know what, I'd scream too. One of the other characters that got some criticism at the time, and I will get into a fist fight with anybody who speaks negatively of Short Round. I'm kidding. But I do really like Short Round. I don't think he's annoying. Some people said that he was a racist stereotype, and I felt like that wasn't fair because Ke Huy Quan, who was the actor that they chose for this role, really was Chinese. He didn't speak English very well, and so he was speaking the lines with his real voice. I mean, that wasn't a put-on. That was his real voice, and he was a brilliant little actor. Of course, he went on to do Goonies, and he was brilliant in that as Data. I really like this character. I think it changes up the Indiana Jones mythos a lot. And when I found out early on that they were going to bring back a sidekick character for Indiana Jones in the fourth film, before we all saw the disaster that was, I had secretly hoped, because I'd seen Ke Huy Quan in interviews, that he's now a fight choreographer, that they were going to bring him back to accompany Indy on this next adventure. And when they didn't, I was like, once again, these guys are just shying away from the greatness of Temple of Doom. So let's talk a little bit about the darkness. Is this film really any darker than Raiders of the Lost Ark? I mean, the criticisms that this film's too dark, it's too violent. Well, here's a shot from Raiders of Forrestal stabbed and decomposing in the tomb in the beginning. Then you've got Satipo getting skewered in the film, blood running everywhere. Then you've got Indiana Jones just cold-bloodedly killing the swordsman in the crowded bazaar.
Which was awesome.
Then you've got them
poor innocent dead monkey. I mean, it's so sad. It's the saddest part of the movie.
They're poisoning monkeys in the movie that, do the Heil Hitler thing. And then you've got the dude who gets chopped up in the propeller and blood flies everywhere. Then you've got Nazis melting horribly from the inside as the Ark fries them into nothingness. And you've got people's faces melting off at the end with their eyeballs falling out. So I guess my question is, can they really sit back and say that Temple of Doom was any darker than Raiders of the Lost Ark? I think there was a myriad of reactions going on, and for whatever reason, I think people just didn't like Willie screaming because they had to find something else to yell about.
Although, honestly, the body count is much higher. If you watch the Plinkett review of the Crystal Skull, he goes through the whole thing and counts the number of deaths in each film, and I think it's more than double.
Yeah, Temple of Doom easily has over 21 deaths or something in it directly related to Indiana Jones' actions, whereas I think Last Crusade Raiders of the Lost Ark has about 9 or 10. And then Last Crusade has 5 or 6 or something like that. So yeah, Temple of Doom certainly has the higher
Crystal
body.
Skull has 1.
Yeah, Crystal Skull has 1. The family-friendly Indiana Jones. So we wanted to show you some vintage footage that Steven Spielberg did in an interview that was has previously never when I say previously, it was previously released on public television in 1984. It's never seen the light of day since. Only certain shots of it have entered into other special features and DVDs. These are his comments about Temple of Doom at the time he was filming it. And then we'll juxtapose that with some comments he and Lucas makes about the movie now.
Sorry, my cursor keeps going away. Okay.
When I first heard the title Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, I thought this was going to be more of a serious adventure for Indiana Jones, more of a dangerous adventure, an adventure that was a little scarier, a little more like a nightmare, like a bad fever dream. And I like that. I like that change of pace, a change of atmosphere. There are some scenes that are violent and depict the evil of the Temple of Doom. This picture is not called the Temple of Roses, it's called the Temple of Doom. The warning is clearly marked on the box.
We did not get an R rating. We, in fact, got a PG rating. But it created a tremendous controversy, and people talked more about how inappropriate Temple of Doom was for younger children. You know, of all the greater indie films, Temple of Doom is my least favorite.
I think we went darker than Names really wanted to go. But you're in the middle of it, and you're doing things, and it's a matter of what you do every moment.
It's like, yeah, we love this. Oh, no, wait, we don't. No, we really don't. Hey, enjoy the refrigerator. Like, it's
Right.
But we talked about this. Melinda and I looked at this and said, you know what? If Temple of Doom were made today, if Temple of Doom was the Indiana Jones 4 that showed up, I think we would have all loved it like gangbusters universally for the first time, because I think it was ahead of its time. I mean, just look at the titles of movies now: The Dark Knight, The Dark World, Dark of the Moon, Into Darkness. Every movie wants to be dark. It wants to be gritty. It wants to be edgy. And Temple of Doom was accused of all of those things in 1984. So I think now, if we brought this movie back out, rather than, and interestingly enough, that's why Crystal Skull was derided when it came out, because it was cheesy, it was goofy, it was syrupy, it wasn't very good. It didn't have the edge to it, it didn't have the grit, it didn't have the violence. And Temple of Doom had that in '84, and you ran it off on a rail. What do you want?
Yeah, if we could only transpose those two films, I think it would probably work a lot better.
I wanted to bring up another example of this real quick. In 1987, Timothy Dalton took on the role of James Bond, and he played it in two films, Living Daylights and License to Kill. And he really tried to dedicate himself to the original Ian Fleming version of James Bond. In doing so, because he'd just come off of the Roger Moore legacy of Moonraker and View to a Kill and Octopussy and all those films, he was kind of run off very quickly by the critics and the audience. This is what they had to say about him at the time. This is Roger Ebert. He's a strong actor. He holds the screen well. He's good in the serious scenes, but he never quite seems to understand it's all a joke. The moment Bond began to act like a real man in a real world, all was lost. Dalton is rugged, dark, and saturnine, and speaks with a cool authority. We can halfway believe him in some of his scenes, and that's a problem. Now, we flash forward, and we get this guy called Daniel Craig, who is in a very great movie called Casino Royale, and this is what Roger Ebert had to say about him. Daniel Craig makes a superb Bond, leaner, more taciturn, less sex-obsessed, able to be hurt in body and soul, not giving a damn if his martini is shaken or stirred. The director is helped by Craig, who gives the sense of a hard man wounded by life and his job. So suddenly the values that were put into play for one performance 20 years before that weren't valued are suddenly now lauded, even by the same person who doesn't remember what they said 20 years ago. So it's a matter of time and place. This is just further evidence to make me feel like Temple of Doom was just in the wrong place at the wrong time when it came out. Temple of Doom also created the PG-13 rating. It was PG, but it said some scenes may be too intense for young children on the poster. To this day, it's still PG. Surprisingly, Last Crusade is PG-13. I wouldn't call Last Crusade more violent than Temple of Doom. I would certainly say Temple of Doom is more violent than Last Crusade. But that's the new standard by which they went afterwards. They can't grandfather Temple of Doom in, but they said, all right, Stephen, we'll come up with another rating for the future so that we can... Because at the time that he made Jaws in 1975, they were going to give it an R rating. And he had to go in and say, there's no sex in this movie, there's no cursing of any real importance. And a shark, their argument was, a shark is not something that a child can recreate in the backyard. They said that. This is the argument for how they got a PG rating for Jaws. They
Guess
said,
it depends on if you live at the beach.
True, but they said that a child cannot go out into the ocean and eat people. So So we're going to give it a PG rating. Whereas with films that depict human-on-human violence, they were like, look, we have to have a middle ground here because Temple of Doom is not R. But Temple of Doom has another cool legacy that the other Indiana Jones films until Crystal Skull cannot match. Temple of Doom was the most commercialized Indiana Jones film of the original trilogy in the 80s.
Back in the 80s, when they would market things to children that were not really for children, like Rambo, for example.
Which was, what, 2 years later when they did that?
Yeah. So Rambo came out, and they made a whole cartoon about it, and look, toys for boys, but, you know, the film is R-rated, so...
Well, Temple of Doom, you know, edged out with a PG rating, and it was highly merchandised. Raiders of the Lost Ark had some merchandising. It had some, you know, trading cards. It had a few action figures that didn't do very well, and then it had, you know, the soundtrack, things like that. But Temple of Doom, they had like 4 different lunch boxes, all metal. They had the magazines you can see here, the comic books, the trading cards, the Nintendo games, the action figures, which didn't last very long. They had the fast food glasses. They had a stand-up arcade cabinet machine that played the Atari arcade Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom game. It's the only Indiana Jones movie to have an arcade game. And it's because they really thought that, you know, this was the launching point for this character. He was going to be, you know, the next Star Wars, and the critical backlash means it didn't happen. And so when you go to Last Crusade, they were like, we're not even going to make toys. We'll give JCPenney some hats, and yeah, we'll give Arby's a license, and that's it. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was also the first one in the series to change the name of the movie. If you listen to interviews with Steven Spielberg, he still refers to them as the Raiders films, because the original plan was to have each movie be called Raiders of the whatever. So it would have been Raiders of the Temple of Doom. But they decided that, no, we need to market the name of this character, because Indiana Jones launched out of Raiders of the Lost Ark as this popular centerpiece of the film, which of course rightly so, but the idea that it was called Raiders of the Lost Ark was harkening back to those serials of the 30s and 40s. So they changed the titles entirely to focus on that. A lot of times I like to joke that there's a movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then there's an Indiana Jones trilogy that follows that's tonally very different from Raiders of the Lost Ark.
So if you're looking for reasons to like the Temple of Doom based on, you know, what we like today, apparently, I came up with a few. Just, you know, if you're friends, if you're talking with them, it's like, well, you know, it's dark and edgy, which seems to be super popular now. It's a prequel, which we love prequels, right? And I will yell now. It's an homage to films of the past, so that's kind of cool. And it's kind of based on a true story, sort of, kind of. And it took risks. I mean, at the very least, you have to say that Temple of Doom really tried something new. They tried to not just make the same movie again and recycle it. They went in a completely different direction from the very beginning of the film, having a musical sequence, which is almost unheard of. I can't think of any other film off the top of my head that has that. And just continued on from there. Right,
and to the point about the true story thing, what we're referring to is that the THUGGEE cult was a real thing in Indian history, and they don't like to bring it back up and talk about it, but it did happen, and that's why Gunga Din is based on it. No, there was no American dude in a cool hat running across a rope bridge, but there was a THUGGEE cult in the history of India, so that's what we're talking about. I've always really liked the rope bridge, and I just wanted to mention this real quick because I do. The movie, I love the fact that it's unapologetic and it goes for broke. Now, Raiders is my favorite, both for my dignity and just because it's awesome. But Temple of Doom, once he's snapped out of it, once Short Round snaps him out of the trance, that movie says, I'm not going to apologize to anybody. I'm going for broke. I'm going to be the most exciting action film you've ever seen. And then it just goes. And it's like the moment he starts punching people that's the great reveal, is when the minecart's being pulled by the kids and the light comes up and Indy's standing there and he's looking really ticked off. And he's like, I really don't like people who enslave kids. You're about to go down. And then it's on. And then for the rest of the movie, from the minecart scene, from the slave fight, minecart scene, the edge of the cliff, the flood, the water being sent down the tunnels, and then the rope bridge. And then he's on the rope bridge at the end. He's surrounded. The chips are down. And he's standing there, and he's like, you know what? Surrender is not in my DNA. So if I go down, you all go down. And he doesn't say that out loud, but he wraps his foot around that rope, and then he's just like, bring it. And I think that, to me, in some ways, is a cooler moment than anything I ever saw in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's kind of like how I love The Empire Strikes Back, but I'll never deny that when Darth Vader ticks off Luke Skywalker at the end of Return of the Jedi and that duel starts, it's one of the greatest moments in the Star Wars trilogy. So I had to get that out there for you guys. I really need to express those feels. Well, I know it's close to time, so I really want to thank everybody for being here today. Thank you so much for coming out and listening to our presentation. We run a retro community. It's just a social place where we can all talk about all this cool stuff that's ongoing and from the past. So if you'd really like to come up and get our email address, we do actually respond to email. We're not just like gathering followers. We'd really like to stay in touch with you. So thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.